Air actually goes into a rectangular cross section at the front of the chassis and flows through that tube to the back of the car to the intercooler at the back. Once I decided on that, it produced its own set of problems, one of which was, where do I put the suspension?
Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Build Biology. I'm Nads, here with Danger Dan. We actually got our friend Trevor Harris, you might remember him from the Z32 episode, to come back for this one. Is actually a GTP car from the golden era of IMSA. Amazing car, built by Electromotive, later became MPTI, driven by Jeff Brabham, like all the best drivers and everything. Amazing, amazing car from an amazing time in motorsports. You ready for this one?
I think we let the man who remembers the golden era actually do this one.
I would love that. I would love to hang out with Trevor again. Let's go back to the Motoring Club and do it all over again.
That time of year again, the SEMA crunch, it's coming. And if you're used to following us as we go into SEMA time, you know what to expect. A whole lot of this. Those fingers in the air! And that. Some more of this. Because for the past 2 years, we've brought some complete insanity to the SEMA show, and it's been a ton of fun. But 2020 is complete mayhem, and conventions aren't really happening the way we're used to it. So SEMA decided to go 100% virtual, and they launched a new platform called SEMA 360. And SEMA 360 is a 100% online experience of SEMA. So if you're a qualified media, a buyer, a seller, or in the industry, you get access to pretty much what SEMA originally was. So you'll get all the goodness that SEMA has always been. So you get to see new product, see new vehicles, interact with the companies, talk with their sales staff, and learn about all the products. Beyond that, there's the Builder Showcase with over 200 cars, most of which you haven't seen yet. And because there hasn't been a lot of car shows this year, there's bound to be some really sick stuff that comes out of the woodwork. You still get your whole experience, it's just a little bit different. But I think that this is gonna be really rad, so make sure to sign up, go check it out, be a part of this. Let's get through this crazy year together.
Well, I think this is pretty awesome because not only do we have Trevor Harris with us again, we have a whole different car. In case you saw our other build bio, we had the 300ZX. Now we have the NPT90 here, and the man who designed the chassis. Trevor Harris has done everything from hot rods to working at Boeing, to working with a guy named Peter Brock on BRE, to working on the 300ZX program, working with guys like Clayton Cunningham and Electromotive and MPTI, which we're gonna get into all that too. Tell us about your history with this car, when you came into play, Cunningham versus Electromotive versus MPTI, all of it.
Well, the GTP car was a multi-year program that Nissan got into in 1985, basically. And Lola built the first GTP car for Nissan. And it was run by a company called Electromotive out of El Segundo. And Electromotive built the engines for the car, which are basically the Nissan V6 motors that come in the 300ZX cars.
The VG30, the original 3-liter twin turbo engines that came in the 300ZX.
Correct. So this car has a turbo motor in it with a 4-cam 300ZX motor with a few more horsepower than the production car came with. It started out with a Lola chassis, and that ran in 85 and 86, and by 87 a gentleman named Yoshi Suzuka had been a really good guy who had worked with us at the BRE Datsuns in 1970. He did the aerodynamics of the early GTP car.
Based on the Lola chassis.
Based on the Lola chassis. The Lola chassis kept having problems in races, but the bodywork appeared to work quite well, and the motor made a lot of horsepower and had gotten quite reliable by the end of 87.
Now that's the difference between engineers and designers too. That's a harmonious headbutting, I would call it, where you have to work, you know, either the aerodynamics comes first or the chassis comes first, but one or the other, there's a give and take with that. So you had to work within essentially the box that Suzuka-san created.
Right. Suzuka was doing the body work, and at the point where Yoshi completed the body work and the engine department completed what it wanted to do to keep the engine alive, which was something different from the earlier cars.
Wider motor, extra engine packaging for all the piping and the intercoolers.
Right.
You know, you have to cool twice as many turbos, so both banks are, it's...
Right. Packaging for the engine was much more complex for this, and just the complexity of the, what we'll call the intake system, where the air hopefully gets into the engine from the outside world, just more complicated. And you'll see on this car, we've got an intake.
Dual intake banks,
yeah,
essentially the snorkels.
Yeah. This car is quite a bit different in shape from our 88 car. The reason for doing the new body work was to see what you could do for aerodynamic improvements with the cars. And this car, actually if it could have run at 200 miles an hour, it actually was capable of making 10,000 pounds of additional force.
That's huge by today's standards.
It's huge by anybody's standards, yeah.
Let me ask you something now. How many learnings did you and Suzuka-san take from the RC90? Because I heard that the original 88 car was based a lot on the Japanese RC90 Group C car.
It was just a matter of trying to make the most aerodynamic downforce that we could make, and it wasn't really based on that. We had all the work that we'd done on the 88 car, plus the models, and Yoshi had done wind tunnel development on that car. The Group C car was actually a very good car also for high-speed tracks. And that body work was done by Lola in England, exactly. And we didn't have anything to do with that car.
When you say high-speed track, you're talking about Le Mans with like the Mulsanne Straight and everything,
right.
And a lot of the courses here are more technical, and you're not really, with the exception of maybe a Daytona, you're not really utilizing a lot of high speed.
With these cars, we ran very fast at Daytona, but in terms of miles per hour, we didn't. I would typically run as much downforce as we could get away with, even at Daytona with these cars. So we found on the banks at Daytona with this car, we were a good 10 miles an hour slower than the Porsches, but our lap times were quicker.
So you're making it up on the infield,
so
is what you're saying?
So we make it up on the infield.
Completely.
The difference between the slowest speed and the maximum speed was much less, that difference, than the Porsches would run. They'd run a very high top speed and go around the corners slowly, and we'd run fast around the corners and slow down the straightaway.
So when you talk about Daytona and you talk about what this is, this was actually run in the IMSA GTP category, which was like the Group C of the FIA series that ran in Le Mans. And when you guys were running, this was pretty much the heyday of the series. You had manufacturers from Mazda, Toyota, Porsche, Jaguar, Dyson was some weird random one.
Chevrolet
ran with
the
Dyson.
Ford was into it at one point. We had good competition, really good competition. So it wasn't easy at all.
Exactly. When you talk about it not being easy, that's another question I have, because this was originally an Electromotive car. But somewhere along the way, Electromotive became Nissan Performance Technology International, MPTI. And that sort of had an influx of backing, almost like a Skunk Works version of Nissan's motorsport thing, not actually in-house at Nissan, but somewhat completely funded by Nissan. How did that transition take place? Were you around for that? Or
yeah, I was around for the transition. Yep. Electromotive was a small company in El Segundo, but after we won the championship in '88 and '89, Nissan, the factory, decided to set up a much larger facility. At Electromotive, we may have had 15 people there, or 20 people full-time.
15 people to win a championship.
The core team was
you would grow on race weekends.
Pretty small group of guys. But Nissan set up a company, a large facility in Vista, California, called Nissan Performance Technology, Inc. And we grew to a company that had 250 people full-time just to run 2 race cars, just 2 of these GTP cars. We just grew with personnel, we grew with capability. We also designed and built a Group C car, which was never raced, unfortunately, because Nissan discovered sometime in '92 that it was losing money in America, and they were spending something like $44 million a year at MPTI winning races, but they decided that it was really too expensive to keep the operation going, so we basically shut down in '93. So we went from hero to zero, as they say, within about a year.
This is a brief window. When we talk about this car, this is actually chassis number 1, correct?
I believe so.
I believe this is chassis number 1, and this is being sold by Stratus Auctions on behalf of Bruce Canepa. Do you think we could take some of the bodywork off and maybe take a look?
Let's do it. I'd like to see some of the car that I had something to do with.
Let's start at the back here, Trevor. This is like just super confusing, amazing, inspiring all at once. This is that 3-liter twin turbo V6 quad cam based on the VG30, Electromotive block, factory heads. We already did the 300ZX. You were saying this did not make as much power as the engine in the 300ZX?
No, actually, this engine is essentially the same.
Pretty much the same. So same boost, same horsepower, same everything.
Depending on the day and depending on the configuration, these didn't always run 3 liters because the way the rules were configured, the displacement was related to the weight of the car. So if you wanted to run a very light car, you had to decrease the displacement, obviously, to theoretically lower the horsepower. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, weight makes a big difference with a race car for lap times. Forget everything else. It's nice to be light. The car itself was basically the same from the first day it ran. I mean, the chassis was the same from 90 to 93, end of 92.
All credit to your design. Oh.
Well, we had a lot of good people. I did the basic monocoque, designed it. I actually hand drew every panel in the monocoque and took care of the suspension design. I designed the rear uprights that hold the wheels and the geometry of the back and the front. We had a terrific team of guys that took care of all ends of this car, including the team that ran it.
You were talking earlier off camera about how you could remove the entire subframe. So it's actually designed to make maybe potentially an engine swap or at least mechanical during a race. You could change things out very quickly.
Well, we couldn't change an engine during the race, thank goodness, but we could change a lot of things that seemingly couldn't be done. For instance, the frame includes a number of bolt-in pieces. There's a triangular brace that comes back to a bulkhead here, a milled aluminum bulkhead that attaches to the top of the spring shocks here, and that bulkhead attaches ultimately to the top of the now invisible gearbox. But there is a steel tubing framework that goes from the back of the monocoque, which is essentially here on the chassis. The back of the monocoque is here, and this tube ultimately bolts onto it along with a tubular member that comes back here, goes down diagonally to the bottom of the monocoque, and then on the bottom there's a triangular brace that's similar to this below the engine. What we call the engine bay is located inside of a completely triangulated box, basically, and the purpose of that is to promote chassis stiffness. You want the twist resistance front to back of the chassis to be as good as you can make it.
Explain really quickly the differences between a complete tube chassis and what's known as a monocoque, and maybe even like, let's start with a unibody. There's 2 different types of road cars. There's a body on frame, which is a frame like a truck, and then a body sits on top of it, and then that's the stiffest, but it's also heavy, it's outdated. Then there's a unibody chassis, which is like the entire cell where you sit in is actually a load-bearing element that all of the suspension componentry, the engine, the drivetrain are all affixed to that. Then when you get into racing, there's what's called a tube chassis, and then there's also a monocoque. And if you could get into the differences between those two.
The monocoque is basically a chassis that's made out of sheet metal for all practical purposes. It can be made out of plastic, it can be made out of any number of materials, but the main thing is a monocoque is built out of sheet construction, like a box of, like a Wheaties box. So the monocoque to this chassis is kind of like a very sophisticated Wheaties box as far as its shape goes. Doesn't have any tubular members in it. And then from the back of the monocoque, which is basically about here, that's the back of the monocoque, we use just steel tubing to make the frame that goes around the engine. And that's really useful to use tubing, because you note that you got to get to a lot of things on the engine and suspension, and a monocoque impedes getting, you can't go through it. It's a flat sheet, sometimes with holes in it, but basically a completely different way to construct a chassis. It yields a stiffer chassis in not all cases, but a basic chassis that's stiffer than a typical tube frame, but where you have to get through a lot of components and easily remove parts. It's very useful to have a tube frame chassis from the monocoque to the back of the car.
So you're saying the tube chassis on the 300ZX, the GTO car, was actually, the GTU car was actually stiffer than this chassis?
The twist resistance front to back is actually markedly stiffer than this. Now it's considerably heavier. The shape of the chassis, since it's a bigger, physically bigger car, the actual cross-section of the different parts of the chassis is much larger than the cross-section of the different parts of this car. And it turned out after we tested it, it's about 50% stiffer than this.
That car also, when you talk about the 300ZX, that car used a traditional 6-speed transmission, and then it also later was upgraded to a transaxle. This car started with a transaxle.
Right, that was upgraded to basically the same transaxle that's used in this. It's a Hewland. The transaxle is at the back of the car, and you can make really quick gear changes with it. The GTO gearbox was located right behind the engine, and the original gearbox. Somewhat more difficult to make a quick gear change in it than this.
Now, not to bounce around a little bit, but I noticed the aero here also that changes from the 300ZX. This is actually a triple element wing. So this creates a lot more downforce.
Way more downforce.
So overall, this car creates more downforce than the 300ZX.
Yeah.
Okay. So knowing that, how did that affect how you set up the chassis on something like this? Knowing that it creates that much downforce, did that affect the way that you built the chassis and designed the chassis?
Well, it affects the way the suspension design goes. These cars have a lot more downforce, so you have to have stiffer springs just to keep the car from running into the ground at speed. So no matter what, the GTP cars always had to be sprung stiffer for a given racetrack than the GTO car.
Can you explain why that is? Because the body is just creating,
just because the body
it's
is
compressing
pushing
so hard down on it, and if you let the springs compress, you're on the bump stops and you're effectively,
or the car's
removing.
into the ground at 100 miles an hour. It's 4,500 pounds pushing down on the total weight of the car. If you could put a scale underneath the four tires, you'd measure 4,500 pounds at 100 miles an hour. It's the body work that's doing that additional, creating that additional 2,500 pounds at 100. So the springs see that additional force. So the springs are looking at what it thinks is something that weighs a lot more than it actually does.
Well, we did the back. Why don't we, can we see the front before we get into the rest of the car?
Sure.
Now, obviously this one, it's the same setup as the Z, but completely different because the engine's in a completely different area.
Completely
now
different.
You have a lot of room here to work with. So you could see, obviously, it's that much lower because you don't have to make room for an entire engine. But you have the radiator here.
Thank God.
Ron was commenting off camera that this feels something like it should be something from Duesenberg or Bugatti, something pre-war. That's there's the artisanal element to this that is unlike anything you see in motorsports today. And I thought that was really cool.
It is cool.
So you had the radiator mounted up front. And then you have the suspension here. How did it affect you with packaging in terms of working with the aero here?
And our engine department very much wanted the intercoolers to be located close to the engine at the back of the car. So the question was, how do we get the air from the front of the car properly into the intercoolers at the back of the car? We have a duct here, and if you look in that duct, you'll see a funny crisscross pattern at the front of the chassis, and air actually goes into a rectangular cross section at the front of the chassis and flows through that tube to the back of the car to the intercooler at the back. Once I decided on that, it produced its own set of problems, one of which was, where do I put the suspension? Where does it actually go on this car?
Because essentially closest to the wheels, you have two large tunnels going
through. The
through.
monocoque misses the tire by about 2.5, 3 inches here. Here's the edge of the monocoque down here. So you'll see the top A-arm comes over to a pivot axis, and then a continuation of it pushes on the spring shock, which goes from below this panel to essentially the center line of the car.
Which is inboard mounted, essentially.
It's inboard mounted, yeah.
Do you think we could remove it?
We should pull that panel off.
We should pull that panel.
So here we have the spring shock assembly that basically goes down to a bracket located close to the center line of the car. So if you wanted to do, which we did a lot of spring shock changes during setup of the car, you pull this panel off and you dive in and you remove this bolt and the one at the base of the shock, and hopefully you get it out of there.
Not a lot of real estate to work with. Ron also discovered something pretty crazy too here. We were trying to figure out what this was. So that's actually the pedal control. That's the pedal box right there. That's how far forward the driver's feet sit, but still behind the front wheels, that's a huge safety thing. If you recall, like old school Formula One cars and even the Porsche 956s, they had your feet were hanging out in front of the back in the day. That used to be a packaging issue,
correct.
Right?
New school Formula One cars have a huge wheelbase, and the driver's feet are considerably aft of the front wheel center line these days. You run into a brick wall at 180 miles an hour, this is not a safe car.
Exactly, exactly. Speaking of driver safety, can we see the office? Can we just open the car up and like take a look inside where the driver sits? Now we get to see inside the office. Trevor was just telling us, what is this little bad boy right there?
Well, this is the top surface of a little rectangular area in the center of the monocoque chassis, and there are 2 tubes that run through that part of the monocoque to get up to the radiators in the front of the car. We had to get water to and from the radiator, so that's what that little area there is about. There's tubing that goes, aluminum tubes that go from the back of the monocoque basically to the front and out to the radiator. Here you're looking at the top of the so-called monocoque chassis, okay, and this is just the top panel of it. It's rather large, much larger than most, but that's the part of the chassis that flows the air back to the intercoolers, which are mounted back here.
I love this too. This is actually the ECU, which is massive by today's standards, you know, when you talk about computing power.
That was produced by Electromotive, and basically the fundamental design was by Don Devendorf. He designed the first all-electric control device for a racing engine.
Wow.
He was ahead of Bosch, and basically Electromotive and our engineering department, which included a group of electronics guys, they designed that complete unit. That's what runs the engine.
I think that also reminds the name of, recalls the name of Electromotive, so that sort of makes sense now.
Right.
It's sort of all coming together. So not only was Don the founder, he came up with that name, and there's a reason he came up with the name, because he was an electronics genius too,
right,
and a great driver as well.
He figured out better ways to run a turbocharged motor than anybody knew how to do in 1980 when he won the GTO championship with an inline 6 that used his ECU to run the engine.
Also love like how much money you guys spent on everything, but you guys kind of cheaped out on the on the door handles here.
Hey,
so
it's lightweight.
this is what saves weight. This
It's
reminds me
very
of
lightweight.
a Ferrari F40. The F40 had the same style of door handles, full race mode right there. I love that.
Hey, it works.
It does. It gets the job done. The doors open and close. I wanted to get in the car and do my best Jeff Brabham impersonation and maybe even pee in the seat like Jeff might have done during a long race. But Bruce Canepa, who's selling this car, has this steering wheel affixed. So my rather girthy physique cannot quite fit in the car. So unfortunately, I won't be able to sit in the car. But this has just been awesome. So what'd you think?
Race car.
It's beyond a race car.
The driver's offset a little bit. Looks like a fighter pilot inside. There's so much tire to the ground.
VG30 based engine too. Not necessarily the best Nissan
Not my
engine
thing.
that they made magic with.
It's insane.
And it's cool to have the man who designed it sort of talk about like, yeah, I guess we could have done it this way. And it's just so much knowledge. Thank you, Trevor Harris. Thank you, Motoring Club. Thank you, Stratus Auctions. Thank you, Dan, for letting me jump in on this one. Awesome time. Oh, over here? Boom, boom, boom.
There you go. Yeah. Just
Okay.
covering the wheel.
Okay.
The snap.
I have no job.
All right, guys, we're getting started.